In the deep frozen expanse of the Saratov region, a landscape defined by its unforgiving winters and vast flat horizons, lies a facility that serves as a cornerstone of Russian military power, the Engels II Air Force Base. Located approximately 700 kilometers from the active front lines of Ukraine, this installation is not merely a collection of runways and hangars, it is a symbol of projection and reach. For decades, this facility has stood not merely as an airfield, but as a fortress of the Russian Federation's long-range aviation command, a pivotal node in the nation's ability to threaten adversaries across the globe. It is the beating heart of their airborne nuclear triad, a sanctuary where the giants of the Cold War era, massive strategic bombers designed to incinerate cities, rest between their missions. To the Russian military planners sitting in Moscow, the sheer geographical depth of Engels II was considered its primary armor, a natural defense far more reliable than concrete or steel. The distance was supposed to be insurmountable, a vast buffer zone that rendered the violence and chaos of the contact line an abstract concept, something to be watched on screens rather than experienced viscerally. This geographic isolation fostered a belief that the war remained far removed from the daily routines of the ground crews servicing the nation's most expensive assets, allowing them to operate with a sense of detachment that would ultimately prove fatal. Into this perceived sanctuary taxied the newest pride of the Russian aerospace industry, a modernized Tu-160M, known to NATO by the reporting name Blackjack and referred to reverently by its crews as the White Swan due to its elegant white anti-flash paint. This was no ordinary logistical transfer or routine rotation of aircraft. The Tu-160 is the heaviest combat aircraft ever built, a staggering feat of engineering that dominates any tarmac it occupies. It is a supersonic variable sweep-wing bomber capable of delivering nuclear payloads across continents, designed to outrun interceptors and penetrate the most sophisticated air defenses of the late 20th century. The significance of this specific airframe cannot be overstated. It was the same model Russia had previously flown to Venezuela in a high-profile diplomatic mission, a calculated gesture intended to intimidate the West and project power directly into the Western Hemisphere. Its arrival at Engels II was meant to bolster the upcoming Winter Strike campaign, serving as a tangible symbol of revitalized Russian air power and a warning to Kiev regarding the coming cold months. However, the psychological climate at the base did not reflect the urgency of a nation at war. Instead, it was one of routine complacency, a dangerous lethargy born of the belief that they were untouchable. The security architecture of Engels II was designed to counter peer-level adversaries, specifically anticipating threats from NATO fighters or high-altitude ballistic missiles that defined the fears of the Cold War. The airspace above the base was guarded by the fearsome S-400 Triumph systems, creating an anti-access area denial bubble that was theoretically impenetrable to conventional air attacks. However, this defense was predicated on a traditional understanding of air superiority, a doctrine that prioritized high-altitude interception and ignored the evolving realities of modern conflict. The base commanders operated under the assumption that stealth meant advanced radar-absorbing materials and billion-dollar airframes developed by state actors. They failed to realize that in the modern theater, stealth can also be achieved through audacity, low-tech materials, and the exploitation of the Earth's own curvature to hide from the prying eyes of radar. The 2 a.m. darkness over the Saratov region hid a changing reality, a shift in the paradigm of warfare that was about to descend upon the sleeping base. While the Tu-160M sat exposed on the tarmac, gleaming in its white anti-flash paint designed to reflect nuclear thermal radiation, it was paradoxically vulnerable to a much simpler, kinetic threat. The Americans, and indeed military analysts worldwide, had long identified the bomber's key weakness. It is a massive, loud, and distinctive target that relies entirely on external protection for survival. Unlike smaller tactical fighters, it has no cloaking device or onboard active defense systems to repel close-range attacks. It relies solely on the sanctuary of its home base. But on this night, the definition of sanctuary was about to be rewritten by an adversary that refused to play by established rules. Ukraine had been watching, observing the patterns of life at the base with patient intensity. They understood that security is not just about the range of a radar system or the number of missiles in a battery, but about logistics, patterns of life, and the arrogance of an enemy who believes they are out of reach. As the base personnel went about their shifts, confident in the layers of air defense protecting them, they were unaware that a coordinated swarm of low-cost drones was already threading its way through the radar gaps, intent on turning their prized strategic asset into a useless liability before it could ever launch a single missile. The illusion of invincibility that shrouded Engels 2 was approximately 90 seconds away from being shattered forever.
To understand why the strike on Engels 2 was a catastrophe for the Russian aerospace forces, one must first dissect the machinery sitting on that tarmac and the immense investment it represents. The primary target, the Tu-160M, is not merely an aircraft. It is a $500 million geopolitical statement, known in the West as the Blackjack. It is the world's largest and heaviest combat aircraft, a hypersonic variable sweep wing heavy strategic bomber designed to deliver nuclear and conventional munitions deep into enemy territory, a capability that few nations possess. The M designation is critical here, distinguishing this airframe from the older fleet. This was not an aging Soviet relic gathering dust, but a modernized variant equipped with new avionics, advanced navigation systems, and crucially upgraded electronic warfare capabilities, intended to keep it relevant in the 21st century. However, the heart of this beast, and ultimately its Achilles heel, lies in its propulsion system. The aircraft is powered by 4 Kuznetsov NK-32 engines, the most powerful engines ever fitted to a combat aircraft, generating thrust that is virtually unmatched in the military aviation world. These constitute a marvel of high-temperature metallurgy and precision engineering, capable of pushing the 275-ton airframe to speeds exceeding Mach 2, a feat of physics that requires tolerances measured in microns. Each engine is a complex assembly of titanium and specialized alloys valued at millions of dollars individually, representing the pinnacle of Russian material science. They are built in extremely limited numbers, with production lines that have only recently been restarted after decades of dormancy following the collapse of the Soviet Union. Damaging these engines does not just mean a simple repair job. It implies a logistical nightmare of sourcing rare components that may not currently exist in the supply chain, effectively grounding the aircraft for an indefinite period. Sitting just 400 meters away from this engineering titan was a threat of a different kind, a concentration of kinetic power that compounded the risk exponentially. The storage facility contained between 50 and 60 Kh-101 air-launched cruise missiles, a stockpile of immense destructive potential. These are Russia's premier long-range precision strike weapons, designed with low absorbance stealth features to evade radar detection and strike high-value targets with devastating accuracy. A single Kh-101 carries a 400-kilogram high-explosive warhead and utilizes a sophisticated guidance suite combining inertial navigation, GLONASS satellite updates, and terrain contour matching to find its mark. They are the spearhead of Russia's winter campaign, specifically targeted at degrading energy infrastructure to freeze the Ukrainian population into submission.
To have nearly 60 of these weapons stored in a single non-hardened facility is tactically baffling and represents a severe failure of risk management. In financial terms, this stockpile alone represents a sunk cost of approximately $700 to $800 million, a staggering amount of capital sitting in a vulnerable shed. In military terms, it represents the ability to strike 60 distinct power plants, transformers, or command centers, a capability that could alter the course of the war if utilized. The juxtaposition on that airfield was stark and illustrative of the conflict's changing nature. On one side, the pinnacle of Russian strategic power, a hypersonic bomber capable of intimidating nations, as it did during its deployment to Venezuela, and a stockpile of missiles capable of freezing cities. On the other, the incoming threat, cheap, commercially adapted drones made of plastic, fiberglass, and off-the-shelf electronics, weapons that cost a fraction of a single bolt on the bomber. The defense of Engels II was oriented towards high-tech threats, intercepting NATO jets or ballistic missiles, systems that operate fast and high. It was ill-prepared for the economic asymmetry of modern warfare, where a $20,000 loitering munition can effectively mission-kill a $500 million bomber simply by inhaling itself into an intake. This target selection reveals a deep understanding of the enemy's limitations on the part of the Ukrainian planners. The Tu-160M's survival depends on speed and altitude once airborne, but on the ground it is a massive soft target, essentially a sitting whale. Its engines are vast vacuum cleaners, sucking in air with tremendous force, and its skin is fragile aluminum and titanium, offering no resistance to shrapnel. By targeting the engines and the fueled missiles, the attackers bypassed the need to destroy the entire airframe with a massive bomb. They simply needed to destroy the delicate, irreplaceable subsystems that make the airframe a weapon. The stage was set not for a dogfight, but for a surgical amputation of Russia's strategic capabilities, a strike that would hurt far more than a simple crash.
Disasters in aviation and warfare are rarely the result of a single catastrophic event. They are almost always the culmination of a chain of minor errors, a sequence of decisions that seem insignificant individually but combine to create a perfect storm. For the Engels II Air Base, this chain began approximately 36 hours before the first drone crossed the perimeter fence. The catalyst was the arrival of the Tu-160M after a transfer flight. Upon landing, ground crews initiated routine post-flight diagnostics, a standard procedure for such complex machinery. It was here that the first link in the accident chain was forged. Sensors detected anomalies in the aircraft's engine control systems and secondary hydraulics. The issues were classified as subcritical, not severe enough to ground the aircraft permanently, but significant enough to require immediate on-site inspection before the next sortie could be authorized. Instead of towing the massive bomber into a reinforced shelter, of which there is a notorious shortage at Engels, revealing a long-standing infrastructure deficit, the decision was made to park the aircraft on an open hardstand on the northern side of the base. For the next 18 to 20 hours, the Tu-160M sat motionless, exposed to the elements and the eyes of the world. In the era of satellite reconnaissance, a static strategic asset is a dying asset. Ukrainian intelligence, likely fusing data from commercial synthetic aperture radar satellites, which can see through clouds and night, along with human assets on the ground, observed this lack of movement. They noted the minimal ground activity around the plane, confirming it was not being prepped for immediate takeoff, nor was it being moved to safety. It was a sitting duck exposed to the sky, its coordinates fixed and verified with absolute precision. Compounding this tactical error was a logistical gamble of immense recklessness that defies explanation. Just 400 to 450 meters from the exposed bomber lay the temporary storage site for the KH-101 cruise missiles. Intelligence reports indicate that these were not empty shells in deep storage, inert and safe. These missiles had been pulled from bunkers, fueled and programmed for the upcoming winter operations, ready to be loaded onto aircraft. They were hot munitions, essentially canisters of high-volatility jet fuel and high explosives waiting for a spark to unleash hell. Placing a fueled missile stockpile in the open adjacent to the fleet's most valuable aircraft violated basic principles of ammunition safety and dispersion, rules written in blood over decades of warfare. The Russian command fell into a time trap, a cognitive bias where they operated under the assumption that the deep interior of Russia provided a buffer of time. They believed they could leave assets exposed for a day or two without consequence because the enemy was too far away to react quickly. They believed the security timeline was measured in days, giving them ample time to fix the minor technical issues. Ukraine, however, was operating on a timeline of minutes, seizing the opportunity the moment it presented itself. As the sun set and the technical crews finished their shifts, the base quieted down, slipping into a false sense of peace. The missiles remained in their crates, the bomber remained on the hard stand, and the trap was set. The Russians believed they were preparing for a future offensive, organizing their pieces for a strike. In reality, they had just created the perfect conditions for their own disarmament. The stillness of the night was not a sign of safety, but the final pause before the kill chain closed around them. The first shot of the engagement was fired not with explosives, but with information and deception. At precisely 2:05 a.m., the acquisition radars of the Engels II air defense network lit up, piercing the electronic silence. The 91 N6E panoramic detection radars began tracking a cluster of contacts approaching from the southwest. These objects were flying at medium altitudes and maintaining a steady speed of roughly 600 to 700 kilometers per hour, a profile that was easy to detect. To a trained radar operator, these signatures were unambiguous. They looked like conventional long-range strike drones, or perhaps older Soviet-era reconnaissance UAVs converted for suicide missions, threats they had seen before. They were loud on the electromagnetic spectrum, flying predictable linear routes that seemed almost to invite detection, screaming their presence to the defenders. This was the bait, a calculated move to draw attention. Russian doctrine relies heavily on the formidable S-400 Triumph system to sanitize the airspace, a system designed to crush such threats. Seeing what they classified as a confirmed threat profile, the base commanders followed standard operating procedure without hesitation. The engagement radars locked on, and a salvo of heavy interceptor missiles roared into the night sky, streaking towards the incoming contacts. From a tactical standpoint, the defense worked perfectly. The systems did exactly what they were designed to do.
The interceptors maneuvered, fused, and obliterated the incoming drones, and the night sky was briefly illuminated by the flashes of successful kills. Radar screens cleared, and reports were logged, threat neutralized. However, this victory was exactly what the Ukrainian planners had engineered. In the brutal economics of asymmetrical warfare, this was a masterful trade. The Russian forces had just expended multi-million-dollar interceptors to destroy what were essentially disposable decoys, cheap airframes likely built from commercial components or repurposed target drones. But the financial loss was secondary to the tactical error. By engaging these high-altitude targets, the Russian air defense network had revealed its active positions, lighting up electronic warfare sensors, and more importantly, its operators had psychologically exhaled.
This phenomenon, known in military psychology as combat relaxation, occurs after a successful engagement. The adrenaline spikes during the combat, the threat is handled, and the crew momentarily lowers its guard, believing the attack is over. The S-400 radars were now scanning the upper atmosphere, looking for more of the same, victims of confirmation bias. They expected the next attack to look like the last one, searching the same vectors and altitudes. They were watching the roof, completely unaware that the real danger was already crawling through the basement window. By forcing the Russians to look up and engage the obvious threat, Ukraine had bought itself a window of electronic noise and operator distraction essential for the next lethal phase. 12 minutes after the first wave was neutralized, the real operation began. At 2:17 a.m., a second group of drones crossed the final perimeter. Unlike the first wave, these machines were not screaming across the sky at high velocity. They were ghosts, flying at speeds of just 120 to 150 kilometers per hour, dangerously close to the stall speed of many conventional aircraft and hugging the terrain at altitudes below 40 meters. In military aviation, this is known as nap of the earth flying, a technique used to evade detection. By staying below the radar horizon and utilizing the natural ground clutter, the radar reflections from trees, buildings, and hills, these drones effectively vanished from the scopes of the long-range S-400 systems. Responsibility for the base's defense now fell to the short-range Pantsir S-1 systems. Designed to catch leakers that bypass the outer layers, the Pantsir combines autocannons and missiles for point defense. However, the system was overwhelmed by the physics of the environment. The electronic interference from the earlier high-altitude engagements combined with the noise of the ground clutter blinded the fire control radars. The operators were left squinting at screens filled with static, trying to distinguish a drone from a truck moving on a nearby road, paralyzing their decision-making loop. The final approach took less than 90 seconds, a blur of motion in the dark. The first targets were the easy ones, the missile storage site. The drones did not need to penetrate reinforced concrete bunkers because of the Russians' logistical error. They only needed to hit the staging area. The impact was precise and devastating. The warheads detonated against the thin-skinned transport containers of the Kh-101 missiles. The result was not a conventional blast, but a catastrophic thermal event. The jet fuel inside the missiles ignited instantly, creating a fireball that reached temperatures exceeding 2,500 degrees Celsius. This is far beyond the melting point of the aluminum alloys used in missile airframes and the delicate guidance electronics. It wasn't just a fire, it was a thermal runaway. The initial explosion triggered a chain reaction, cooking off the solid fuel boosters and turning the storage area into a furnace that no fire suppression system could touch. While the base's attention and emergency crews were magnetized by the inferno at the missile depot, the remaining drones executed a maneuver of terrifying precision. They banked towards the northern hardstand where the Tu-160M sat exposed. The Russian air defense crews, panicked by the explosions at the depot, swung their turrets wildly, firing blindly into the dark, but it was too late. The drones were already too close. They didn't aim for the fuselage or the cockpit, which might have been repairable. They targeted the intakes. The Tu-160's massive air intakes are designed to gulp thousands of cubic feet of air per second to feed the NK-32 engines. The drones flew directly into these maws. The explanation occurred inside the engine nacelles. There was no massive Hollywood-style explosion that shattered the aircraft into pieces. Instead, the damage was surgical and total. The high explosive fragmentation charges shredded the titanium compressor blades while they were stationary, turning precision engineering into scrap metal. The shock wave expanded through the bypass ducts, severing hydraulic lines and crushing the fuel control units deep within the engine housing. In less than 2 minutes, the attack was over. The Tu-160 looked largely intact from a distance, but internally it was a wreck. Its heart was ripped out, its motive power destroyed. The KH-101 stockpile was a molten ruin. The sanctuary of Engels II had been violated not by a massive bomber fleet, but by a handful of slow-moving propellers and a strategy that exploited the blind spots of a superpower. As the sun rose over the Engels II airbase, the extent of the catastrophe became visible through the dissipating smoke, revealing the scale of the defeat. The immediate aftermath was defined by chaos and paralysis. Fire crews were forced to halt hundreds of meters from the missile storage site, unable to approach. They were held back by the intense heat and the erratic secondary explosions of solid fuel boosters cooking off, popping like deadly firecrackers. The storage facility had effectively become a hazmat zone, with toxic fumes from composite materials and rocket propellant drifting over the airfield, complicating any recovery efforts. The 50 to 60 KH-101 cruise missiles were not merely damaged, they were fused into useless slag, a total loss. This loss represented an immediate firepower gap in the Russian inventory. To put this in perspective, assuming a standard production rate, replacing this specific batch of precision-guided munitions would take the Russian defense industry months of triple shift work. This challenge is exacerbated by ongoing sanctions that restrict access to critical microchips, making the replacement process even slower and more painful. However, the more complex disaster lay on the northern hardstand. To the untrained eye, the Tu-160M appeared surprisingly intact. There were no gaping holes in the fuselage, no broken wings, but in the lexicon of military assessment, the aircraft had suffered a mission kill. The drones that struck the engine intakes effectively weaponized the concept of foreign object damage, FOD. When the warheads detonated within the intake cowlings, they sent a spray of high-velocity shrapnel directly into the compressor stages of the NK-32 engines. These engines rely on the precise balance of thousands of titanium blades spinning at incredible RPMs. The explosion shattered the intake fans, sending broken metal cascading deeper into the high-pressure compressor and the combustion chamber, essentially causing the engine to eat itself. The damage is internal, systemic, and catastrophic. Repairing an NK-32 engine is not a field-level task. It cannot be done by ground crews at the airbase. These are among the most complex engines in existence. The aircraft must now be disassembled and the engines removed and transported back to the manufacturer, likely the Kuznetsov Design Bureau in Samara or the Kazan Aviation Plant. The repair process involves specialized tooling, magnetic particle inspection to detect microcracks in the engine mounts, and the complete remanufacturing of the core components. Given the scarcity of spare parts and the fact that NK-32 production lines have only recently been revitalized, analysts estimate the downtime for this specific bomber to be between 6 to 9 months. Furthermore, the shock of the explosions likely compromised the airframe's hydraulic integrity and sensitive avionics suites located near the wing roots. The White Swan has been grounded not by a dogfight, but by a logistical amputation. Russia retains the shell of the aircraft, but its function, the ability to project power, has been completely stripped away. The base command is now left with a heavy, immobile museum piece that occupies valuable tarmac space and requires constant security, yet offers zero operational value to the ongoing war effort. The smoke over Engels II eventually cleared, but the strategic fog it generated has permanently altered the operational landscape of the war. The true impact of this strike is not measured merely in the charred remains of aluminum or the downtime of a single bomber. It is measured in the forced behavioral changes of the Russian high command. By sunrise, the consequences had rippled far beyond the blast radius. Acknowledging that Engels II, once considered a deep rear sanctuary, was no longer secure, the Russian aerospace forces initiated a massive dispersal protocol. Remaining strategic bombers were ordered to redeploy to bases in the extreme Arctic, Olynya Air Base and the Far East, pushing them thousands of kilometers away from the Ukrainian border. This logistical redeployment is a victory for Ukraine. By forcing Russian bombers to operate from more distant airfields, Ukraine has imposed a distance tax on every subsequent mission. A flight that previously took 4 hours now takes 8 or 10. This doubles the fuel consumption, doubles the accumulation of flight hours on airframes that are already difficult to maintain, and significantly increases pilot fatigue. The operational tempo, the rate at which Russia can generate sorties, has been mechanically slowed down, without a single Ukrainian fighter jet taking off to intercept them. The strike also serves as a brutal case study in the new economics of asymmetric warfare. The exchange ratio of this engagement is staggering. Ukraine utilized a swarm of drones with a collective cost likely under $500,000. In exchange, they neutralized a stockpile of missiles worth nearly $1 billion and sidelined a strategic bomber that is essentially priceless due to its irreplaceability. Furthermore, they forced the Russian air defense network to expend millions of dollars in S-400 interceptors against cheap decoys. This is a rate of attrition that even a superpower cannot sustain indefinitely. It proves that in modern conflict, mass and budget can be defeated by precision, timing, and the exploitation of cost disparities. Finally, this operation shattered the doctrinal assumption of the safe rear. For decades, military planning relied on the idea that distance equals safety. That era is over. The Engels II strike demonstrated that with enough intelligence and creativity, the front line is everywhere. A technician working on a bomber deep in the Saratov region is just as much a combatant on the contact line as an infantryman in a trench. Ukraine did not need to physically steal the Tu-160M to remove it from the board. By turning the pride of the Russian fleet into a hangar queen and incinerating the weapons it was meant to carry, they achieved a total strategic denial. They proved that the most effective way to defeat an enemy's air force is not to fight it in the air, but to dismantle the intricate, fragile ecosystem that allows it to fly. The lesson for military observers worldwide is clear. We have moved past the age of big aero offensives and into the age of systems disruption. The question posed at the beginning of this analysis remains the defining query of our time. In a world of cheap drones and pervasive surveillance, do you prioritize protecting the shiny, prestigious symbol of power, or do you protect the boring, vulnerable logistics that actually make that power real? The ruins at Engels II suggest that Russia chose the former and paid the ultimate price for it.